Simone Dailancourt died in perfect composition. The afternoon light, the camera on her lap, the handwritten note, each placed with the precision of a photograph she'd already taken in her mind. Outside, roses bloomed against rain-streaked glass. Inside, silence held its breath. She had spent a lifetime being captured by others. This time, she framed her own departure, not disappearance, completion. September 4th, 2017, Normandy, France. In a stone cottage that smelled of old books and wild roses, an 86-year-old woman closed her eyes for the last time. No cameras but the one in her lap, no spotlights but pale Norman sun, no audience but hundreds of photographs scattered across a wooden table. Images of a face the world had worshipped, then forgotten, then desperately tried to reclaim. The neighbor found her the next morning, seated by the window, a Polaroid camera against her chest. On the table lay a single photograph, a self-portrait taken hours before death, her face bare, her hair white, her eyes staring into the lens with something like recognition or perhaps relief. On the back, in elegant script, "I was here, that's enough." When news finally reached Paris, it sent tremors through every atelier, every archive, every aging photographer who remembered what it meant to work with a woman who understood that stillness was not absence of movement, but presence of everything unsaid. Vogue published a black-bordered tribute. The Museum of Modern Art dimmed lights where her most famous portrait hung, that 1955 Avedon image, Simone by the window in white Dior, forever captured in the act of almost vanishing. But the cottage revealed secrets no one expected. Boxes filled with unseen photographs, hundreds of self-portraits spanning 5 decades. Simone at 40, unsmiling in a bathroom mirror. Simone at 60, face bare and defiant. Simone at 80, staring into the lens as if challenging it to finally tell the truth. On each one, handwritten notes. "This is what 60 looks like. I still don't recognize her. But I'm learning. The last face I modeled for was mine. Who was this woman who graced covers of Harper's Bazaar and Vogue hundreds of times, yet refused every interview, every memoir offer? What drove her to disappear at fame's height when Balenciaga still called her his muse? And why, in those final decades, did she turn the camera on herself? Not in vanity, but in what seemed like archaeological excavation, digging through layers of image to find the woman buried beneath. Her death was ruled natural. Heart failure, simple, clean. But those who knew her whispered darker questions. Was isolation a choice or escape from something glossy magazines never showed? And in those unpublished self-portraits, was she searching for who she used to be, or trying to prove she had existed at all? To understand how it ended, we must understand how it began. Not in camera's flash, but in shadowed streets of post-war Paris, where a young girl learned that beauty could be both gift and curse, a door into the world, and a cage that locked from the inside. Paris, 1930. In a modest apartment on the edge of the 18th arrondissement, a baby girl was born to a seamstress and a clock repairman, people whose lives revolved around precision, silence, and mending broken things. They named her Simone, after a grandmother who survived the Great War by learning when to speak and when to stay invisible. Her mother, Marguerite, worked long hours stitching lace collars for women she'd never meet. Her father, Henri, repaired timepieces for bourgeois families. They existed in that precarious space between working class and invisible, the kind of family Paris wrote no songs about. Simone's childhood was quiet, not peaceful quiet, but disciplined quiet. Her mother believed beauty without order was chaos, and chaos was dangerous. From the time Simone could walk, she was taught to sit still, keep hands folded, speak only when spoken to. Un visage propre, une vie propre, Marguerite would say, pulling her daughter's hair into braids so tight they made her temples ache. A clean face, a clean life. There were no dolls, no frilly dresses. Marguerite dressed her in simple cotton, always white or gray, and warned constantly about vanity, about drawing attention, about dangers that came with being noticed. Beauty, her mother said, gripping small shoulders with work-worn hands, is not for playing, it is for surviving. Even as a child, Simone understood she was different, not in ways children boast about, but in ways that made adults stop talking when she entered rooms. Strangers stared. Shopkeepers gave extra sweets. Teachers called her une petite statue, a little statue. By age 7, she realized the terrible truth. Her face did not belong to her. It belonged to everyone who looked at it. Could this early awareness have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? This child's understanding that she was simultaneously precious and public property? Her father was kinder. He taught her to read by tracing fingers over watchbox labels. Cartier, Longines, Patek Philippe. These names, he told her, winding his pocket watch, mean something because they last, not because they're loud. Things of value were built to endure, not to dazzle. On Sundays at Jardin du Luxembourg, they sat on iron benches watching the world pass. He rarely spoke, neither did she. But she learned to observe how light changed faces, how posture told stories, how stillness could say more than movement. "Why do you always watch people, Papa?" she asked once. He was quiet then. "Because, ma chérie, if you watch long enough, you see what they're hiding." A lesson that would haunt her forever. Understanding that surfaces concealed depths, that every face was a mask, that being seen was inseparable from hiding. The war came when Simone was 9. Paris fell under occupation. Her father's shop closed. Her mother lost work. They survived on rations, on silence, on the careful art of being invisible. Simone learned that drawing attention could be dangerous. She stopped looking people in eyes. She walked head down. She became a ghost in her own skin. But even ghosts can be beautiful. And beauty in wartime was currency more valuable than food. There were men, German officers, collaborators, who noticed her even then, a too thin girl with sharp cheekbones and eyes like cold water. Her mother gripped her hand tighter, passing soldiers on streets. "Ne les regarde jamais," she hissed. "Never look at them." Simone obeyed. But she felt their eyes anyway, like hands she couldn't shake off. She learned beauty was not neutral. It was dangerous. It made you visible when visibility could kill, or worse. The war ended, but something in Simone did not return. She had learned her face was not her own, that beauty was not gift but target, that the safest thing was invisibility. Yet paradoxically, she could not be invisible. Her face would not allow it. By 16, Simone worked as secretary in the same textile workshop where her mother once sewed hems. Monotonous work, typing invoices, filing orders, answering phones. But it was safe, invisible, exactly what her mother wanted. Except Simone had begun to feel like she was disappearing. Not wartime invisibility as survival, but deeper, more existential. Every morning she looked in mirrors and saw a stranger, a face everyone said was beautiful, but that she couldn't recognize as her own. "Who are you?" she whispered to a reflection once, alone in the washroom. The face stared back silent. She had no answer, and that terrified her more than any bomb, any soldier, any war. It was spring 1950 when everything changed. Simone was 20. Walking along Avenue de l'Opéra during lunch break, eyes on pavement, mind far away. She didn't notice the man with the camera until he stepped directly into her path. Pardon," he said in accented French, "American, but I have to photograph you." She looked up, startled. Tall, sharp features, eyes that didn't blink. He held a Rolleiflex like it grew from his hands. "I'm Richard Avedon. I'm a photographer." He tilted his head, studying her from multiple angles. "And you have a face that doesn't belong to this century." Simone wanted to walk away. She'd been taught to distrust strangers, especially men with cameras, but something in his voice stopped her. Not charm, not seduction. Certainty. "I'm nobody," she said quietly. He smiled, not kindly, but with recognition. "Not yet," he replied, "but you will be." 3 days later, she stood in a borrowed studio on Rue de Turenne, wearing a white dress that wasn't hers, while Richard Avedon circled her like a predator. The studio was cold, lights harsh. She felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with clothing. He didn't tell her to smile, to move, to do anything. He simply watched, camera raised but not clicking, eyes narrowing and widening. "Don't perform," he said finally. "Just exist." Simone didn't know what that meant. She'd spent her life performing, obedience for her mother, invisibility during war, normalcy at work, the role of beautiful object for strangers who stared. She didn't know how to stop, but she tried. She stood still. She breathed. She let silence fill the room, fill her body until she felt both empty and full. And Avedon pressed the shutter. He didn't discover her. He exposed the absence she'd already become. Years later, Avedon would say that developing that first role, he knew he'd captured something extraordinary. She wasn't a model, he told Vogue in 1965. She was a meditation on what it means to be seen. The photograph appeared in Harper's Bazaar 3 months later. No elaborate makeup, no dramatic styling. Just Simone by a window, light cutting across her collarbone, eyes focused on something outside the frame. Or perhaps nothing at all. The caption: "The new face of silence." Within weeks, every couture house in Paris wanted her. Dior, Balenciaga, Givenchy, Balmain. Her mother wept when the first contract arrived, not from joy but from something darker, prophetic. "This is not a life for girls like us," Marguerite whispered, but it was too late. Simone had already disappeared into the camera's gaze. Was the success she achieved truly worth all the pain she endured? Or was she trading pieces of her soul for a beauty that would never belong to her? The fashion world in the early 1950s was a cathedral of illusion. Gilded, sacred, utterly ruthless. And Simone Dylancourt, with her perfect stillness and face like a Renaissance painting, became its most devout disciple and eventually its most famous ghost. After that first Avedon photograph, offers came like floodwater. Christian Dior wanted her for his new look campaign. Cristobal Balenciaga requested her personally. Hubert de Givenchy, meeting her, simply said, "You are the only model who doesn't need instructions, you already know." But what did she know? Only that when she stood before a camera, something inside went silent, not empty, but complete, as if she truly existed only when someone else was looking. She worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. 14-hour days in freezing studios while photographers barked instructions and designers adjusted hemlines with pins in their teeth. She learned beauty was labor, that elegance required pain, that a perfect photograph meant holding breath until ribs ached, keeping neck elongated until muscles screamed, and never letting face betray discomfort. "Modeling is not acting," a senior model told her once, exhaling cigarette smoke. "It's the opposite. It's unacting. You become the dress. You become the light. You stop being yourself." Simone understood. She'd been practicing that her entire life. Other models were competitive, sharp-edged, hungry. They saw Simone as threat, not because she was aggressive, but because she required no effort to be extraordinary. She didn't smile, didn't flirt, didn't play games. Yet photographers worshipped her. "Why do they love you so much?" one model asked bitterly after Simone was chosen for another Vogue cover. "You barely speak, you never smile, you just stand there." Simone didn't answer. How could she explain she didn't want their love? That every camera click made her feel more of herself disappear? Richard Avedon became her anchor. Not a lover, but something deeper. He understood her in ways no one else did. Most models want to be seen, he told her once. You want to be invisible. That's why you're perfect. You give the camera what it wants most. The fantasy of capturing something that can't be captured. He was right. Every Avedon photograph was a study in absence. Simone in Dior, eyes closed. Simone in Balenciaga, face turned away. Simone in Givenchy, looking at something the camera couldn't see. Critics called her the ghost of haute couture. Editors called her enigmatic. Other models called her cold. But Avedon saw truth. She's not cold, he said in a rare interview. She's terrified. Of what, he never said. And Simone never told him. But the answer was devastating. She was terrified of disappearing, and terrified of being seen. And she couldn't figure out which was worse. By 1955, Simone was no longer just a model. She was an icon. Her face appeared on Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Elle more than any other model of her generation. She walked for every major designer, was photographed by every legend, Irving Penn, Norman Parkinson, William Klein. But it was Avedon's photograph from that year that changed everything, shot in his Paris studio on a cold February morning. Simone wore white Dior with plunging back, standing by a tall window as winter light poured in. Avedon gave no direction, simply said, "Look down." She did. The photograph is almost unbearably beautiful. Simone's profile sharp against light, neck impossibly long, shoulders luminous. She looks like a woman on the edge of vanishing, not into sadness, but into something else. Transcendence, or surrender. For the first time the subject met the self, and neither knew who had been posing. Avedon titled it Simone Paris, 1955. Everyone else called it The Birth of Modern Elegance. It was exhibited at MoMA, appeared in textbooks, was analyzed, imitated, worshipped, and Simone, seeing it for the first time, felt nothing but dread. "That's not me," she told Avedon quietly. He looked at her with pity. "I know," he replied, "but it's who you'll always be." She understood then she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd given her face to the world, and the world would never give it back. The late 1950s and early 1960s were Simone's golden age, and her gilded cage. She was everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously the most visible woman in Paris and utterly invisible. She wasn't fleeing fame. She was escaping the echo of her own reflection. Christian Dior said, "When Simone wears my dresses, they don't need jewelry. She is the jewel." Balenciaga called her the only model who understands that fashion is architecture, not theater. Givenchy wrote in private journals, "Simone does not walk, she floats. She exists in a dimension the rest of us can only visit through a camera lens. To the world she was untouchable, a goddess carved from marble and light." Behind the perfection, Simone Deloncourt was drowning. She worked 7 days a week, 16 hours a day. She ate sparingly, black coffee, cigarettes, occasional fruit. Not from vanity, but because hunger kept her sharp. "If I eat," she told Avedon once, "I feel too human. And humans don't belong in these photographs." She had no social life, no lovers, no close friends. She lived alone in a tiny Marais apartment, walls bare except for a single mirror she covered with cloth every night. She couldn't bear to see her own face anymore. It had become public property, reproduced endlessly until she no longer recognized it. "Do you ever feel like you're disappearing?" she asked Givenchy once after a grueling show. He looked concerned. "Non, chérie, you are more visible than anyone." "That's the problem," she whispered. Behind all that glamour was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. She was the still point in a world that mistook stillness for peace. The contrast between public image and private reality was stark. In photographs, eternal, flawless, serene. In life, fragile, crumbling. She suffered from insomnia so severe she sometimes went days without sleep. Migraines left her blind and vomiting. She chain-smoked and drank too much coffee. Her hands shook when no one watched. Once, during a 1961 Vogue shoot, she fainted mid-pose. The photographer was furious, had to reshoot everything, but Avedon, assisting that day, caught her before she hit ground. "You need to stop," he told her urgently. "This is killing you." "I can't," she replied, voice barely audible. "If I stop, I disappear." He gave her immortality. She gave him herself. Neither survived the exchange unchanged. "You're already disappearing," he said, voice breaking. But she didn't listen. She returned to set 20 minutes later, face freshly powdered, expression perfectly blank. The photographs from that shoot are still considered some of her most beautiful. No one would ever know that less than an hour before, she'd collapsed. By 1963, cracks began showing, not in photographs, which remained flawless, but in her spirit. She'd been modeling 13 years. She was 33 and so tired. Fashion was changing. New models emerged. Twiggy, Jean Shrimpton, Verushka, bringing movement, rebellion, playful irreverence. They smiled. They laughed. They looked like they were having fun. Simone looked like a monument, beautiful but immobile, perfect but dead. "You're too serious," a young Elle editor told her bluntly. "The 60s are about liberation. You look like you're in mourning." Simone didn't argue. What could she say? That she was mourning, not for something lost, but for something she never had? Designers still wanted her. Avedon still photographed her. But she felt the shift. The world was moving on. She was becoming a relic of a bygone era that valued silence, stillness, restraint. On her last shoot with Avedon in 1964, she told him something that would haunt him forever. "When you photograph me next time," she said quietly, "I won't be here." He lowered his camera. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer, but her eyes said everything. 10 years later, using that final photograph for a retrospective, he wept. Because he understood too late what she'd been trying to tell him. She was already leaving. Had been leaving for years. And no one had noticed. The collapse came not with a bang, but a whisper. Spring 1965, Simone was 35, still in demand, still booked solid, on paper invincible, in reality disintegrating. She missed a Givenchy fitting, unheard of. Arrived late to a Vogue shoot, hands trembling, eyes glassy. Asked mid-shoot if she could sit down. The photographer refused. She fainted, hit the floor hard. Hospital doctors said acute exhaustion and severe malnutrition. Press called it minor incident. But Simone knew truth. Her body was giving up. Worse, she wanted it to. "I don't want to be beautiful anymore," she told a nurse. The nurse laughed. "Every woman wants to be beautiful." "No," Simone whispered. "Every woman wants to be seen. Beauty just makes you a mirror." When she returned to work 2 weeks later, something fundamental had shifted. She could still pose, still hold the stillness. But the light in her eyes, the thing Avedon called the whisper between light and skin, was gone. Photographers noticed. "She's flawless," one told Vogue's editor. "But there's nothing there anymore. It's like photographing a beautiful corpse." Did this tragic event mark her downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems festering for years? The industry had no patience for fragility. When word spread Simone was difficult and unreliable, phone calls slowed, offers dwindled, designers looked elsewhere. The new generation smiled more, complained less. She tried to adapt, cut her hair short, wore mod styles, even tried to smile for the camera, something she'd never done. But it didn't work. The smile looked wrong, like a mask poorly fitted. One journalist wrote, "Simone Deyancourt's attempt to reinvent herself feels less like evolution and more like desperation." Givenchy tried to help, invited her to his atelier, asked gently what she needed. "I need to stop," she said. "Stop what?" "Pretending." He simply held her hand. "Then stop. It's okay to stop." For months, Simone existed in limbo. Took fewer jobs, stopped answering her phone, stopped going to parties, became once again invisible. Winter 1966, she received a letter from Avedon. He was preparing a major MoMA retrospective and wanted her there. "You are the centerpiece of my career," he wrote. "Without you, none of this matters." She stared at the letter for hours, then wrote back one sentence. "I was never the centerpiece. I was the frame." Avedon called immediately. "What does that mean?" "It means," Simone said quietly, "I was never the art. I was just what held it in place. When people look at your photographs of me, do they see me? Or do they see your genius?" He was silent. "I'm not coming to New York," she told him. "I'm done, Richard. I've been done for years." She hung up. That was the last time they ever spoke. The turning point came from something simpler than revelation. A photograph she never meant to take. Late 1967. Simone was 37, hadn't worked in over a year. While cleaning a drawer, she found an old Polaroid camera, a gift she'd never used. On impulse, she loaded film, walked to the bathroom, pulled the cloth off the mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger. Not because she'd aged, but because she finally looked real. No perfect lighting, no strategic angles, just her. Plain, tired, human. She lifted the camera and pressed the shutter. The photograph developed slowly. When she saw it, she wept. Not from sadness, but from recognition. For the first time in decades, she saw herself. Not the icon, not the muse, not the ghost. Just Simone. Every click was a resurrection in reverse. Each photograph bringing her closer to being real. She took another photograph, then another. By week's end, her apartment was covered in Polaroids, self-portraits in mirrors, by windows in morning light. In some, she looked at the camera. In others, turned away. But in all, she was present. "This is who I am," she whispered, "not what they made me." Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? She made a decision. She would leave Paris, leave fashion, leave behind the name Simone Dayancourt and everything it represented. She needed to find out who she was when no one was watching. Spring 1968, she bought a small cottage in Normandy. A stone house surrounded by fields and gardens miles from the nearest city. The opposite of Paris. Quiet, isolated, forgotten, perfect. She told no one where she was going, simply packed a suitcase, left apartment keys on the table, and disappeared. Fashion world barely noticed. By then, Simone was already a ghost, a name occasionally mentioned but largely forgotten. A few journalists tried to find her. Leads went nowhere. The woman they were looking for, the untouchable icon, had never been real. She'd been a performance. And now, finally, she was gone. Normandy wasn't exile, it was exposure with no camera. In Normandy, Simone started over. She planted roses, learned to bake bread, walked through fields at dawn, hair unbrushed, face bare, body finally her own. She read Rilke and listened to Bach, painted watercolors, and took Polaroids, not for anyone else, but for herself. Proof that she was here, that she was real. "I am here," she wrote on one photograph, "and that is enough." But healing wasn't linear. Days when the weight of her past crushed her. Days when she looked in mirrors and saw only the ghost. Days when she wondered if leaving fashion meant erasing the only proof she'd ever mattered. Givenchy found her once in 1972. Arrived with white roses and worried expression. "Why did you leave?" he asked. "Because I was disappearing," she said simply. "But you were at the height of your career." "No," she interrupted. "I was at the height of your career, all of you. I was never mine." They had tea. Before he left, he embraced her, something he'd never done in all their working years. "You were always more than a muse," he whispered. "I know," she replied, "but I needed to prove it to myself." He never visited again. But every year on her birthday, she received white roses with no note. She always knew who sent them. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? Both. Surrender to the life she'd been told to live. Self-preservation from the death she'd almost chosen. In Normandy's quiet, far from cameras and the relentless gaze of a world that had never truly seen her, Simone Dayancourt finally learned to breathe. The years in Normandy were not the ending of Simone's story, but the beginning of the one she'd always wanted to write. She lived modestly. No telephone for the first decade. No television, just books, records, and rhythmic seasons. She painted badly but sincerely, wrote in journals no one would read, taught herself piano and took photographs, thousands of self-portraits. Not of landscapes, but of herself, in mirrors, windows, garden at twilight, her face bare, hair white, eyes no longer empty but searching. "I am learning to look at myself," she wrote in 1975, "not as the world sees me, but as I am." But the world hadn't entirely forgotten. Every few years, a journalist tracked her down asking for interview, memoir, retrospective. She refused all. "Why?" one persistent writer asked at her doorstep. "Don't you want people to know your story?" "They already know my story," Simone replied. "They just don't know it's not the real one." "Then tell them the real one." She smiled, rare, sad. "If people saw me once, they've seen enough." She closed the door. Her only regular visitor was Margot, a young painter from the village who had no idea who Simone had been. They met by accident. Margot got lost, knocked asking for directions. Simone invited her for tea. They talked about art, about silence, about being women whose value is determined by others. Margot returned every week. Eventually it became ritual. Sunday afternoon tea in the cottage that smelled of roses and contentment. "Why do you live alone?" Margot asked once. "Because I'm not alone," Simone said. "I'm with myself, finally." In 1999, Margot brought her a Coco Chanel biography. Simone paused at a quote. "Fashion fades, style is eternal." She closed the book. "Fashion faded, but so did I, and I'm still here." "You didn't fade," Margot insisted. "You just stopped performing." Simone looked surprised. "How did you know?" "Because I've seen your photographs, the self-portraits. They're the most honest things I've ever seen." Something cracked inside Simone's chest. Not painfully, but like a door opening after years locked. "I want to show them," she said suddenly. "Show who?" "I don't know yet, but I want someone to see them before I die." But as years passed, Simone's resolve wavered. The self-portraits remained hidden in boxes. She told herself she'd sort through them someday, but she never did, because part of her believed that once she showed the world her real face, the performance would begin again. And she couldn't bear that. By 2015, she'd selected 200 images. Herself at 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. Her face changing, aging, less recognizable as the icon, but more recognizable as herself. She wrote to Margot, "I've decided. I want them shown. Not in my lifetime, but after I'm gone." "Will you take care of them?" Margot called. "Of course, but why not now?" "Because," Simone said, "I want to be gone before people start looking again." On September 3rd, 2017, Simone woke early, made coffee, sat by the window watching morning light through roses. She felt tired, but not badly, just ready. She picked up her Polaroid camera and took one last photograph of herself in the mirror. On the back, she wrote, "I was here, that's enough." She placed it on the kitchen table, climbed into her favorite chair, and closed her eyes. When the neighbor found her the next day, she was still sitting there, camera in her lap, photograph face up on the table. Simone Deloncourt was gone, but for the first time in her life, she'd left on her own terms. News of Simone's death traveled slowly. Quiet obituary in Le Monde, brief Vogue mention. But within days, fashion world erupted. Not with grief, but with something more complicated. The sudden need to reclaim a woman they'd forgotten. Museums scrambled for retrospectives. Editors wrote elegies. Avedon's estate called her the greatest muse of the 20th century. The 1955 photograph was shared millions of times with captions like, "A timeless icon." But people writing tributes had no idea who Simone actually was. They only knew the woman in photographs. The ghost. The world framed her once to own her. Now it frames her to understand itself. The real discovery came 2 weeks later when Margot arrived at the cottage. What she found stopped her breath. The cottage was filled with photographs. Not famous ones, but self-portraits, hundreds, thousands, Polaroids pinned to walls, film prints stacked in boxes, images of Simone at every age, in every light, raw, unguarded, utterly real, and on each one handwritten notes. This is what 60 looks like when no one is watching. I still don't recognize her, but I'm learning to love her anyway. The camera was supposed to make me immortal. Instead, it made me invisible. These photographs are my resurrection. I was here. I was real. I existed beyond the image. Margot wept, not from sadness, but from awe, because she understood immediately what these were. Not vanity, not nostalgia, but defiance. A woman who'd spent her career being seen, spending final decades learning to see herself. The exhibition opened in Paris, spring 2018. Simone Dailancourt, The Invisible Years. The gallery divided in two halves. On one side, iconic fashion photographs. On the opposite wall, self-portraits. The contrast was staggering. One wall showed a woman transformed into image, commodity, cultural artifact. The other showed a woman fighting to remain human, to prove she existed beyond what others saw. Critics called it the most important fashion exhibition of the decade. The New York Times wrote, Simone Dailancourt was not just a model. She was an artist documenting her own disappearance and reappearance. But controversy erupted. Some argued displaying self-portraits violated her privacy. This is exploitation, one critic wrote. Margot responded, she did want them shown. She just didn't want to be alive to see it, because she knew people would make it about her beauty again. And it was never about that. It was about her humanity. Among photographs, investigators found journals spanning 50 years. Most was mundane, but scattered throughout were passages hinting at darker currents. They think I left because I was tired, but that's not the whole truth. I left because I was afraid of what I might do if I stayed. 1968. Sometimes I wonder if the woman I was ever existed at all, or if she was just a performance I perfected so well that I forgot it wasn't real. 1979. There are days I regret leaving, not because I miss the work, but because I miss being seen, even if it was a lie. 1991. I think about death often, not because I want to die, but because I want to know if I'll still exist when no one is looking. 2005. These revealed a woman far more conflicted than serene self-portraits suggested. A lifetime of doubt, loneliness, constant effort to convince herself she'd made the right choice. The journals were never published in full, but Margot released selected passages with a note. She wanted to be understood, not pitied, not worshipped, just understood. Fashion historians have since dissected every aspect of Simone's life. Some view her as a tragic figure, a woman destroyed by an industry that consumed beauty without conscience. Others see her as pioneer, someone who walked away from fame at its height and created life on her own terms. But perhaps the most interesting interpretation came from a Sorbonne PhD student who wrote Simone Dailancourt and the Aesthetics of Refusal. She argued Simone's greatest art was not modeling but her disappearance. By refusing to play the game, by rejecting the narrative fashion wanted to write, Simone created space for other women to question their own performances. She didn't just leave fashion, the dissertation concluded. She dismantled the myth of the perfect woman. By achieving ultimate beauty and walking away as if it meant nothing, she revealed that perfection itself is a trap. That beauty is a performance we can choose to stop performing, and that is revolutionary. But what of darker theories whispered in fashion circles? Was Simone's death truly natural? Or were there forces the official reports never acknowledged? Some noted the timing. She died weeks before the Avedon retrospective was set to tour internationally. Coincidence? Or did someone want to ensure she wouldn't complicate the carefully constructed myth? Others noted peculiar details. Her body wasn't found for 24 hours, despite neighbors supposedly checking regularly. Who was last to see her alive? Why were there no phone records from her final week? Official cause of death, heart failure due to old age. Natural causes, simple, neat, final. But was it the whole truth? Or was the official story, like so much of Simone's life, a carefully constructed illusion? We will never know for certain, because Simone Dailancourt, more than anyone, understood the power of mystery, the beauty of what remains unseen. Her legacy is complex, to some, cautionary tale, to others, hero. But to those who truly look at the self-portraits, who read the journals with empathy, who understand her struggle, Simone Dailancourt is something else entirely. She is proof that beauty is not the most interesting thing about a woman. That silence can be a language, that disappearing can be an act of creation, and that the bravest thing you can do is look at yourself, really look, and say simply, I was here. That's enough. In the end, Simone didn't leave behind a dynasty. She left behind a question. What does it mean to truly see yourself? The answer, like the woman herself, remains just out of focus. A whisper between light and skin, a face half turned away, a life lived on the edge of visibility. She turned disappearance into authorship. The rest of us are still learning how to follow her out of the frame. The final self-portrait, taken hours before death, hangs now in MoMA, directly across from Avedon's famous 1955 photograph. The juxtaposition is intentional, unbearably poignant. On one wall, Simone at 25, perfect, untouchable, eternal. On the opposite, Simone at 86, lined, weathered, human, real. Between these two images lies a lifetime, a question, a journey from surface to depth, from image to self, from performance to presence. Visitors often stand between these photographs for long minutes, looking back and forth, trying to understand how the same person could be both. Trying to understand which is more real. The answer, of course, is both, and neither. Because Simone understood that we are all both image and reality. That we perform ourselves into existence. That the face we show the world and the face we see in mirrors alone are different faces, but both real. Most of us never question this duality. We accept it. We live in it. We let the gap between image and self widen until we forget there was ever a gap. Simone never forgot. She spent her life navigating that gap, measuring it, trying to understand it. And in the end, she left us a map, not of how to close the gap, but of how to live honestly within it. That, more than any photograph, more than any runway walk, more than any captured beauty, is what will last forever. If visibility is power, why does it so often feel like surrender? And when a woman learns to see herself without witnesses, is she vanishing or finally alive?